Welcome back to New Venture Farm in the southern province of Zambia. Since our last video about 9 months ago, we've had a lot of frustration and setbacks. I suppose we've learnt a lot from those setbacks, so very briefly. Our grid still won't allow me to install a grid tie inverter, so when we're not using the solar wagons for other uses, we cannot supplement our electricity supply. We can only split the load. This is not as convenient because there's no flexibility in matching the load to the available sunshine. Although I'd always thought of the solar wagons in terms of three-phase industrial power, there have been times when I've needed single-phase. I've opted to use a three-phase motor running a single-phase generator, and it works. It keeps my office going during power cuts, but it didn't work so well for these strimmers. These were designed to only accept a very narrow frequency range, and we had to bypass the electronics in order to use them at all. I'm hoping the manufacturer of my inverter can come up with a better solution. We never actually intended to use these strimmers to cut the grass of the farm's football pitch, to deal with the late weeds in our crops. This will probably be the subject of our next video in about December of this year. I think we are going to need peak power monitoring technology. I cannot remember if they call it peak power or maximum power point tracking, but it's a little box of electronics which only allows the solar panels to draw the maximum amount of energy that is available at that moment. It seems counterintuitive because most people would assume that if you want to get the maximum power from a panel, you would connect it to a big load and the panel would simply deliver everything that's available. But it's not so. When one does this, as we have been doing during the last few months, and some cloud passes over, it's almost as though the panels stall. With power point tracking, the amount of power delivered is rationed, which keeps the panel voltage higher, which means that the reduction in power is not quite so severe. A small advantage perhaps, but every little bit will help. We tried to use the solar wagons to run this pump during a power cut, and I knew the load was much more than the solar wagons were capable of, but we were desperate to keep planting. Despite quite good sunshine, they only delivered about 7 kilowatt. With the power point tracking, we would have got the full 10 kilowatt. I'm afraid we are going to need batteries. I'd really hoped we could avoid them, as not only do they add considerably to the weight and to the capital cost, but they also add enormous to the running expenses of the solar wagon. The panels, the inverters, the motors, the switchgear should all have life expectancies of at least 10, maybe even 20 years. But the batteries, if we are lucky, might have a life expectancy of only 2 or 3 years. But it seems that there are costs that I will just have to meet if we're going to get more reliable performance from the solar wagons. I don't want to get too technical, but I would love somebody out there to manufacture a complete package in one box. The power point tracking for the solar panels, the battery management system for the charging of the batteries, the grid tie for when we're sharing power with the grid, and load management through the frequency so that the box can lower the frequency of the power being supplied to the load to keep within the amount of sunshine being received and the battery power remaining. For many applications, like pumping water, pumping some water is better than pumping no water. Anyway, after that long digression, what you're going to see today are my 2 solar wagons making hay. The first one is cutting the grass using 3 mowers similar to what you saw in the first introductory video. Even this simple mower has caused us a lot of frustration, mostly to do with balancing the 3 mowers and with fixing the blades. We're still working on improving it, but the mower cuts a swath of 2.6 meters wide, which is quite useful, even by tractor standards. And we have set the mowers to work at only 1000 RPM. This appears to be fast enough to cut the grass and limits the amount of vibration that we're still experiencing at higher speeds. The second solar wagon is powering this mini round baler with a single 11 kilowatt motor. What's fun about this project is we're using very old-fashioned technology in combination with very modern technology. You've seen the oxen at the front, and the design for these rake wheels, I imagine, is at least 80 years old. They came off a friend's scrap heap, We put them together. They're actually mounted on a frame which came off my scrap heap. They're suspended there by springs which came off my scrap heap. And we couldn't find bearings for them down here. So they're actually running on oiled woodblock bearings, which are absolutely perfect for this application. Very slow running. We put them on here to help guide the grass in front of the baler. Not only with oxen cutting the grass, but also with oxen pulling this baler. We can't always align the baler exactly with the windrow, and the windrow is fairly indistinct. So these rake wheels just guide the grass into the center to go into the baler. We're cutting the grass in a center pivot field, and I thought we would try and work in a big spiral, which would have eliminated the problem of turning at the headlands. However, we found that when we were running in the east-west direction, and we're quite close to our winter solstice, we weren't getting enough sunshine. So we've gone back to running more or less in a north-south direction, which means we have the problem of turning at the headlands and rearranging the panels every time we turn. That's actually given me the idea that when we come to build the second Mark II version, we're going to change it. Okay, what I have in mind for the Mark II solar wagon is that we'd still have 4 wheels in the 4 corners, but these wheels would be powered, motorized, and they could turn in a full 360 degrees. We'd also increase the number of panels, so instead of 4 arrays, we'd have 6 arrays. Those ones on the front would give us extra power to power the wheels, but they'd also give us a bit of spare power in case the mower or whatever other machine we're using was going through a heavy workload. And the advantage of having the motorized wheels in all 360 degree direction is if we had our field and the sun was coming from this side, let's call it the east, the machine would be able to work down the field until it gets to the end, and when it reaches the end, instead of turning the whole machine round, it would just travel sideways and come back up again. And the same thing at the top of the field, it would just travel sideways and go back down, and we wouldn't have the constant problem of tipping the solar panels left and right to catch the sun. If the field was such that the sun was coming from this side, we could actually get the machine to go up and down the field like that. It wouldn't have to try and orientate the sun because the sun was constantly coming from the side. And the machine that we're using, say the mower, instead of putting it on the back there, we'd put it on the side. And so that's definitely what I have in mind for the Mark II at some stage in the future. Any farmers watching this video will note that we're way too late in cutting the grass for good quality hay. Part of the reason was the delay in getting the mower right, and part of the delay was because of the unusual amount of cloud that we experienced in March and April. I still think it's worth making the hay because it contains a considerable amount of pasture legumes, which still contain enough protein. We're also cutting the grass too high. I intend to change the mowers for next year to allow us to cut much lower, but also when we planted this pasture 3 years ago, I had no intention of making hay from it, so we didn't bother to smooth the field as uniformly as we need for haymaking. These legumes bring me to another very important topic. With the current price of oil below $100 a barrel, the solar wagons cannot actually be justified economically. Even when I have developed them further, the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that they save will be small in the general scheme of things. Which doesn't mean to say that I don't believe that they're still worth developing further. It's just that they're not going to save the planet from the climate change on their own. Our far more significant attempts at reversing the rise in atmospheric CO2 is the planting of various legumes and also various improved grasses in our grass layers between the cropping cycles. By significantly increasing the biomass grown during our 4-year lay, we not only provide much better food for our cattle, but also, hopefully, sequester much more carbon in the soil as part of our soil organic matter. less carbon in the atmosphere, the extra organic matter in the soil will make our soils much more resilient to drought or to flooding. So it's a kind of double win.
Mwenye na muko